Today we are going to learn what are invasive species. The first thing we need to look at is what is a habitat. A habitat is defined as an organism's natural home or preferred environment. For example, this would be the natural home or preferred environment for roadrunners and lizards and cacti. You would never find a koala in a desert. Koalas live in the coastal islands and woodlands of Australia where they can find eucalyptus trees, their food source. Penguins live in the Antarctic, not the Arctic. It's a cold environment with lots of snow and water for them to swim in. What do you think is the native environment for tulips? You might think Holland, but that's not correct. They actually naturally grow in the mountains. So here's the question. What would happen if an organism was moved out of its native habitat and into a new environment? Think about the effects on the organism itself, the old environment, and the new environment. Pause the video as you think about and write down these things. Sometimes when a creature is moved to a new habitat, there's really no negative impacts. In the United States, maize and barley are native. Rice and wheat are not, but they have had no negative effects and actually are really positive for giving us food. This illustrates two things that can happen. Species can be neutral or positive to their new environment. However, sometimes creatures can become invasive, which means they spread in an uncontrolled way and cause harm to the ecosystem. There are three things that make an organism invasive. First, they must adapt to the new area easily, they reproduce quickly, and they cause harm to the property, economy, or, in this case, native plants and animals. The Burmese python have become invasive in the Everglades. They compete with native predators for food, habitat, and space, and can even eat the eggs of alligators or baby deer or bobcats. Nutria have come to the United States from South America. They eat a quarter of their body weight every day in plant matter, and they have destroyed wetlands and crops, caused soil erosion, damaged human-engineered flood control system, and spread disease. Naturally found in Europe, garlic mustard is now here and outcompetes native plants and flowers for space and light, and it produces chemicals that kill fungi in the soil and kills butterflies that feed on the plant. Watch this TED Ed video to learn more about invasive species and think about how they spread.
We've all seen the movies where a monster, created by scientists in a laboratory, escapes to wreak havoc on the outside world. But what if the monster was not some giant rampaging beast destroying a city, but just a tiny amount of seaweed with the potential to disrupt entire coastal ecosystems? This is the story of Caulerpa taxifolia. Originally a naturally occurring seaweed native to tropical waters, in the 1980s, one strain was found to thrive in colder environments. This trait, combined with its beautiful bright green color and ability to grow quickly without maintenance, made it ideal for aquariums, which it helped keep clean by consuming nutrients and chemicals in the water. Further selective breeding made it even hardier, and soon it was used in aquariums around the world. But it was not long before a sample of this aquarium-developed superalgae turned up in the Mediterranean Sea near the famed Oceanographic Museum of Monaco. The marine biologist who found it believed that the museum had accidentally released it into the ocean along with aquarium waters, while museum directors claimed it had been carried into the area by ocean currents. Regardless of how it ended up there, the non-native Caulerpa multiplied rapidly, having no natural predators due to releasing a toxin that keeps fish away. And like some mythical monster, even a tiny piece that broke off could grow into a whole new colony. Through water currents and contact with boat anchors and fishing lines, it fragmented and spread throughout Mediterranean coastal cities, covering coral reefs. So what was the result of this invasion? Well, it depends on who you ask. Many scientists warn that the spread of Caulerpa reduces biodiversity by crowding out native species of seaweed that are eaten by fish, with the biologist who first discovered its presence dubbing it killer algae. Other studies instead claimed that the algae actually had a beneficial effect by consuming chemical pollutants, one reason the aquarium strain was developed. But the disruption of a natural ecosystem by an introduced foreign species can have unpredictable and uncontrollable effects that may not be immediately visible. So when Caulerpa taxifolia was discovered at Carlsbad's Agua Hedionda Lagoon near San Diego in the year 2000, having most likely come from the dumping of home aquarium water into a connecting storm drain, it was decided to stop it before it spread. Tarps were placed over the Caulerpa colonies and chlorine injected inside. Although this method killed all other marine life trapped under the tarps, it did succeed in eradicating the algae, and native eelgrass was able to emerge in its place. By responding quickly, authorities in California were able to prevent Caulerpa from propagating. But another occurrence of the strain in the coastal wetlands of Southeast Australia was left unchecked and allowed to spread. and unfortunately, a tarp cannot cover the Mediterranean Sea or the Australian coast. Invasive species are not a new problem and can indeed occur naturally. But when such species are the results of human-directed selective breeding or genetic modification and then released into the natural environment, their effect on ecosystems can be far more radical and irreversible. With the proliferation of new technologies and multiple threats to the environment, it is more important than ever for scientists to monitor and evaluate the risks and dangers, and for the rest of us to remember that what starts in our backyard can affect ecosystems half a world away.
But how do these creatures even get to these new areas? Pause the video and write down at least 3 ways you think these invasive species get to new habitats. Some of the ways invasive species get to a new habitat include people accidentally moving them, or even purposefully introducing them to help control a different pest population, importing non-native plants for landscaping purposes, or even releasing unwanted pets into the wild. Before you go any further, stop the video and head to this web address. Read the article from National Geographic about invasive species. Take a few minutes to listen to this story about an invasive toad threatening Madagascar. Madagascar is a very unique island found off the coast of Africa that contains a lot of species that are found nowhere else in the world. This story was done by PRI. Here, take a listen.
I'm Marco Werman, and you're listening to The World. Madagascar is one of those places that evokes end-of-the-earth remoteness. It's not just a reputation. All the lemurs and chameleons we think of as associated with that big island nation off the southeastern coast of Africa, they're all a legacy of the island's millions of years of isolation. But Madagascar is no longer so isolated, and one new arrival has environmentalists and some local residents concerned. Bobby Bascom has our report.
Along a bumpy dirt road in a village on the east coast of Madagascar, villagers cook skewers of meat over an open fire to a soundtrack of Malagasy music playing from a small shop. It's a typical scene here, but something isn't quite right. If your ears are attuned to it, you can hear an interloper amid the din around the village. The low croaking sound of the Asian common toad. Madagascar doesn't have any native toads, so local resident Jean-Francois knew something was wrong the first time he saw one.
When
the toads first arrived, we were surprised and confused. People still don't know why they've come to Madagascar.
The prevailing theory is that the toads hitched a ride on a container ship from Asia. Madagascar's largest international port, Tomasina, is ground zero for the toad invasion, and this village, Farafati, is just a few miles away. Farafati chief Razana Mahinina says he's been seeing the toads for about 8 months.
There are a lot of toads in my courtyard and around my house. I'm afraid for my children because if they play with them, they could get sick. I've heard the toads can kill people.
You don't have to look very hard to find one.
There's one sitting on the plastic.
Maya Moore and Bernard Yambasharidson from Madagascar Fauna and Flora Group have come to Farafati for a toad hunt. It starts just a few feet from Razana's house.
Look, one is there.
Oh, so there's another one. There's 2 there.
Ah, 2, yes.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Bernard grabs a piece of plastic trash and tries to catch one.
Hops fast. Ah! Got it.
The toad is about the size of a fist, brown and bumpy. But its most striking characteristic, the thing that's got people here worried for their children, is a pair of small sacs on its back. Bernard presses one of them with a stick and a milky white liquid oozes out. It's mildly poisonous, a common feature in toads, and a deterrent to predators in its natural habitat. It's no real threat to people, but you wouldn't know it from local news reports. One said that the toads are biting people, and that they even surrounded a cow and killed it. But as exaggerated as these reports might be, the toads do pose a real risk to Madagascar's environment.
There's already been reports of some endemic boa snakes that have tried to eat the toads that were found dead because of this. And even some birds and mammals that sometimes eat the toads could be at risk.
That's Jonathan Colby, a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland in Australia. He's keeping a close eye on Madagascar because of what happened when a very similar species arrived in Australia. Aussies have been singing the blues about the cane toads since they were first introduced some 80 years ago. From just a few dozen individuals, the toxic toads quickly spread across all of northern and eastern Australia, causing local extinctions of native animals in their path. And Colby worries about a similar situation unfolding in Madagascar.
These toads are able to adapt to a wide variety of habitats. That virtually means it can spread across the island.
That could be very bad news here. Most of Madagascar's native plants and animals are found nowhere else on Earth, and some 90% of the country has been deforested. So what's left of its natural ecosystems is highly endangered and vulnerable to disturbances from invasive species. So far, the toad outbreak here is confined to a roughly 12-mile radius, and scientists are hatching a plan to eradicate the amphibians later this year.
It's going to be a massive effort on the ground because we're dealing with all kinds of different terrain and areas that are difficult to access.
That's Maya Moore again from Madagascar Fauna and Flora Group. She says authorities will try to remove egg masses, fence off potential breeding grounds, and poison eggs and tadpoles with non-toxic chemicals like citric acid and caffeine. They'll also need to enlist local people to kill adult toads, a task for which there should be no problem finding volunteers.
I'm afraid of the toads. They're ugly and poisonous.
That's Aileen, a 22-year-old Farafati resident.
We have no use for them. If there's something we can give them to kill them, we should do that.
For the World, I'm Bobby Bascom, Farafati, Madagascar.
Now let's take a look at invasive species close to home, found right here in Lake Michigan. Take out your Our Waters worksheet. Let's look at it together. Read over the introduction with me. The waters of southeastern Wisconsin are vast, but vulnerable. We depend on our waters for drinking water, irrigation, industry, transportation, power production, recreation, and scenic beauty. Understanding our region's water-related issues and future challenges can help us protect clean, abundant water for generations to come. Lake Michigan's food web. A food web is the interconnected feeding relationships among species in an ecosystem. A food web cycles material and energy through Lake Michigan's living organisms. For example, algae converts sunlight to food energy and is consumed by tiny animals, small fish, predators, and eventually decomposers. In the food web, you have predatory fish, prey fish, macroinvertebrates, zooplankton, and phytoplankton. You can see from the picture here on the computer that these are color-coded. Phytoplankton are green, zooplankton are blue, microinvertebrates yellow, prey fish red, and predatory fish are purple. Take a minute and look at it. Now I would like you to read over the back of your Our Waters worksheet. As you do this, make sure to note some of the native fish that you're reading about, which fish that you're reading about are non-native, and which fish that you're reading about have actually become invasive. Once you identify those, think about the effects, either positive or negative, of the non-native species that have been listed in your article, and also what have been some of the effects of the species that have actually become invasive and harmful to the Lake Michigan food web. Now that we've learned all this information about invasive species, what questions do you have? Is there anything that you've been wondering about? Write down some questions on your paper and we can present those questions in class tomorrow. Those can be a jumping off point for more learning about invasive species. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope it helped you learn.